What if the intricate web of the global economy collapsed instantaneously overnight? Consider the scenario. What if the United States, the world's largest economy, plunged into a recession, setting off a domino effect that crushed entire nations? A staggering thought, isn't it? While it might seem like an extreme hypothetical, the underlying reality is far more precarious than many realize. Numerous countries find themselves standing perilously close to an economic precipice, their stability intrinsically linked to the economic health of the U.S. Their very survival hinges on the American economic engine continuing to run smoothly. It may sound like hyperbole, but the truth is stark and undeniable. The world has witnessed a multitude of significant events recently, reshaping the geopolitical and economic landscape. From ongoing conflicts and shifting trade alliances to technological disruptions and persistent inflationary pressures, the global environment is in constant flux. Understanding these interconnected events is crucial for navigating the complexities of our modern world. Today, we delve into one critical aspect of this global interconnectedness: the profound impact a potential U.S. recession could have on economies around the globe. We will explore the specific vulnerabilities of 10 key nations, examining how their deep ties to the American market place them at significant risk. Stay with us as we unpack these intricate economic relationships, revealing the potential consequences that could unfold. We believe this analysis is vital, and if you find value in this kind of deep dive, please consider supporting our channel. Subscribing and hitting the like button significantly helps us reach a wider audience and continue producing insightful content. We also love hearing from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's examine the nations teetering on the edge. We'll present our comprehensive conclusions at the end of this analysis. You might initially assume that Mexico, with its own substantial economy and proximity, would be somewhat insulated from the direct shocks of a U.S. downturn. Perhaps you think its diverse trade relationships offer a buffer. However, guess what? You would be profoundly mistaken. The economic destinies of the United States and Mexico are interwoven with a depth that often goes unappreciated. These two economies are not just neighbors. They are deeply integrated partners, and a stumble in one inevitably sends tremors through the other. Billions upon billions of dollars in trade flow across the border annually, creating a vast network of mutual dependence. This constant exchange encompasses manufactured goods, agricultural products, and intricate supply chains that span both nations. When American consumer demand falters, the ripple effects are felt immediately south of the border. A sudden economic downturn in America wouldn't just cause a minor setback for Mexico. It possesses the potential to utterly devastate the Mexican economy, reversing years of progress and creating widespread hardship. The scale of this interdependence cannot be overstated. In the year 2023, a revealing statistic underscored this reliance. Approximately 80% of Mexico's total exports were destined for the United States market. This figure alone highlights the immense exposure Mexico has to the economic fluctuations of its northern neighbor. Key sectors driving this export volume include the automotive industry, where complex supply chains crisscross the border, electronics manufacturing, feeding the insatiable American appetite for gadgets, and agricultural products, supplying everything from avocados to tomatoes to U.S. consumers. These industries are pillars of the Mexican economy, employing millions and generating substantial revenue. Therefore, a significant drop in U.S. consumer demand, a hallmark of any recession, would hit these vital sectors like a tidal wave. The reduction in orders and cancellation of contracts would lead to factory slowdowns, reduced production, and ultimately job losses on a massive scale, sending Mexico spiraling downwards economically. Please make sure to watch this video until the end, as we will be drawing important conclusions from this analysis. The impact wouldn't be confined to just the export sector. You'd be genuinely surprised, perhaps even shocked, at how rapidly a decline in U.S. demand could translate into severe domestic consequences within Mexico. The chain reaction would be swift. Reduced export revenue leads to lower corporate profits, which in turn forces businesses to cut costs, often starting with layoffs. This surge in unemployment creates a vicious cycle. Unemployed workers have less money to spend, leading to decreased domestic consumption, further hurting businesses and potentially triggering more layoffs. This downward spiral can quickly escalate, leading to widespread poverty and straining social safety nets. The economic pain felt by businesses and workers would inevitably ripple through Mexican society, potentially leading to social unrest and political instability as citizens grapple with diminishing economic prospects. The interconnectedness ensures that America's economic health is not just a foreign policy concern for Mexico, but a matter of fundamental domestic stability. But the vulnerabilities don't stop there. That's not the complete picture. Mexico's increasing dependence on remittances, money sent home by Mexicans working in the United States, has evolved into another critical economic lifeline, particularly for millions of families in rural and less developed regions. These funds often constitute a significant portion of household income, used for basic necessities like food, housing, education, and healthcare. They are a vital source of foreign exchange for the country as a whole. Remittances act as a crucial shock absorber, providing stability during periods of domestic economic weakness. However, this reliance creates another point of significant vulnerability. If the U.S. economy falters and enters a recession, job opportunities for migrant workers diminish, and wages often stagnate or decline. Consequently, the flow of these vital remittances would slow dramatically, perhaps even reducing to a mere trickle compared to previous levels. This sharp reduction would leave entire communities, heavily reliant on these external funds, struggling desperately to survive, exacerbating poverty and inequality across the nation. The cumulative effect of these interconnected vulnerabilities, overwhelming reliance on U.S. trade for major industries, and deep dependence on remittances from workers in the U.S., paints a stark picture. Should the United States enter a significant recession, the combined impact could push Mexico's economy beyond its breaking point. Reduced exports would cripple key industries, leading to mass unemployment. The simultaneous drying up of remittance flows would devastate countless families and communities, removing a critical social safety net. The government's ability to respond would be hampered by reduced tax revenues and potentially increased social spending demands. The result? A nation pushed perilously close to the edge, facing the very real prospect of a total economic collapse, a scenario with profound implications not only for Mexico, but for regional stability as well. Mexico stands as a prime example of how deeply intertwined neighboring economies can become, for better or for worse. Now, let's turn our attention northward. What if Canada's deep-seated reliance on the United States economy, often viewed as a source of strength and stability, turned out to be the very reason its own survival is perpetually at risk? You might be genuinely shocked to discover the sheer extent of Canada's dependence on its southern neighbor. It's a relationship that goes far beyond simple trade. It permeates nearly every facet of the Canadian economic landscape. The United States isn't just a trading partner for Canada. It's the indispensable trading partner, the behemoth whose economic tides invariably lift or lower the Canadian boat. Approximately 75% of all Canadian exports find their destination south of the border. This staggering figure illustrates an economic umbilical cord that transmits both prosperity and potential peril. While this close relationship fuels Canadian growth during American economic booms, it also means that if the U.S. economy were to fall into a recession, Canada's economy wouldn't just catch a cold. It would be plunged into serious, potentially critical trouble. You might naturally assume that Canada, with its vast wealth of natural resources, timber, minerals, and especially oil, could weather a U.S. downturn by relying on these intrinsic assets. Surely, a country so richly endowed could survive independently. But the economic reality is far more complex. The truth is, even the value of Canada's precious natural resources, particularly oil, is inextricably tied to American demand. Oil prices are notoriously sensitive to global economic activity, and the U.S. remains a primary driver of that activity. A slowdown in the U.S. economy inevitably leads to reduced energy consumption, pushing global oil prices downward. This directly impacts Canada's lucrative oil sector, centered largely in Alberta. A sustained period of low oil prices, triggered by a U.S. recession, would deliver a massive hit to this vital industry, leading to reduced investment, project cancellations, and significant job losses within the energy sector and related industries across the country. The ramifications extend far beyond the oil sands. A struggling energy sector often correlates with broader economic malaise in Canada. Significant job losses in a high-paying industry like oil and gas reduce overall consumer spending and confidence. Furthermore, the Canadian housing market, particularly in resource-rich provinces, is often sensitive to the fortunes of the energy sector. A prolonged slump could trigger a housing market crash, further damaging household wealth and consumer spending. You might think Canada's robust social systems, universal health care, employment insurance, could act as effective buffers against such economic shocks. While these programs undoubtedly provide crucial support, the immense economic strain caused by a deep U.S. recession, coupled with falling resource revenues and widespread job losses, could overwhelm even these strong safety nets. The pressure on government finances would intensify, potentially pushing the country towards a financial crisis and leaving millions of Canadians scrambling desperately to find stability in an increasingly uncertain economic environment. Could Canada truly survive economically detached from its U.S. ties? Given the depth of integration, it seems highly improbable. Let's journey across the Pacific. Have you ever pondered how vulnerable a recognized technology giant like South Korea could be to the economic fortunes of the United States, specifically in the event of a U.S. recession? It might seem counterintuitive, given South Korea's status as a global innovator and exporter. However, you would be genuinely shocked by the profound level of interconnection linking their economies. Their fates are intertwined in ways that make South Korea exceptionally sensitive to downturns in the American market. South Korea is the birthplace and headquarters of global corporate powerhouses such as Samsung and Hyundai, names synonymous with cutting-edge electronics and automobiles worldwide. A vast and crucial portion of the products manufactured by these and other Korean companies, from semiconductors and smartphones to cars and ships, heads directly across the Pacific to the United States consumer market. This reliance creates a significant vulnerability. The numbers tell a compelling story. In the year 2023, more than 14% of South Korea's entire gross domestic product, GDP, was generated from exports solely to the United States. This highlights a substantial dependence on the continued purchasing power of American consumers and businesses. The electronics and automotive industries are particularly exposed. These sectors are not just important. They are fundamental pillars of the South Korean economic miracle, driving innovation, employment, and national wealth. Consequently, what happens when the U.S. economy, the primary destination for these high-value goods, falters? A sudden recession in the U.S. would drastically reduce demand for South Korean products. American consumers would postpone purchases of new phones, televisions, and cars. Businesses would cut back on technology investments. This sharp decline in demand would send shockwaves through South Korea's export-oriented economy. The semiconductor industry, arguably South Korea's most critical export sector and a global leader, would face an especially severe downturn. American technology companies are major buyers of South Korean memory chips and other components. During a recession, these U.S. firms would inevitably slash their budgets, reducing orders for semiconductors. You might think that this impact would be contained within the tech sector, but that would just be the beginning of the fallout. The downturn in semiconductors and other major exports wouldn't merely affect the tech industry. It would create a ripple effect cascading across the entire South Korean economy. Reduced export earnings lead to lower corporate profits, decreased investment, and inevitably, significant job losses, not just in manufacturing but also in supporting industries. Furthermore, the financial strain could lead to a collapse in domestic consumer confidence, as households worry about job security and economic prospects. This could trigger a broader economic domino effect, potentially stalling South Korea's economic engine. Imagine an entire nation of tech-savvy individuals suddenly facing layoffs, stagnant wages, and rising inflation due to a lack of export demand. The economic instability could even spread to other East Asian economies that are part of South Korea's complex supply chains and rely on its exports. Could South Korea survive a deep U.S. recession unscathed? Given its export dependency, it looks like a ticking time bomb. Now, let's consider the economic giant of South America, Brazil. What if Brazil, boasting the largest economy on the continent, could be brought to its knees by something seemingly distant, a recession unfolding in the United States? It's a scenario that underscores the pervasive nature of global economic interconnectedness. You would likely be shocked to learn just how susceptible Brazil's economic stability is to the health of the U.S. market, far more than its regional dominance might suggest. Brazil's vast exports to the United States encompass a wide range of goods, critically including agricultural commodities like soybeans, essential minerals such as iron ore, and significant quantities of oil. These exports form a cornerstone of Brazil's trade balance and overall economic activity. However, this reliance on commodity exports creates a distinct vulnerability. When the United States, a major global consumer, catches an economic cold, commodity-dependent nations like Brazil often face a full-blown economic flu. The mechanism is straightforward, but potent. A U.S. recession typically leads to reduced global demand for raw materials and energy. This decreased demand puts downward pressure on global commodity prices. For Brazil, this means lower prices for its key exports, soybeans, iron ore, and oil, resulting in significantly reduced export revenues. This directly impacts Brazilian farmers, mining companies, and the state-controlled oil giant, Petrobras. But the shockwaves wouldn't stop at the export sector's edge. Brazil is already grappling with pre-existing economic challenges, including relatively high unemployment figures. A sudden downturn in trade, particularly in the crucial agricultural sector which employs a large portion of the workforce, would only exacerbate poverty and deepen existing inequalities, potentially reversing progress made in social development. The decline in export earnings would shrink the national income, making it harder for the government to fund social programs and infrastructure projects. Furthermore, the economic stress would exert enormous pressure on the Brazilian currency, the real. Reduced foreign exchange earnings from exports, coupled with potential capital flight as investors seek safer havens during a global downturn, could lead to a sharp depreciation of the real. A weaker currency, while potentially boosting export competitiveness in the long run, initially fuels inflation by making imports more expensive. Imagine a scenario where Brazilians face soaring prices for everyday goods while job opportunities dwindle, a recipe for widespread social unrest. Adding to this volatile mix is Brazil's government debt, which has climbed significantly in recent years. A major economic shock could make it harder for the government to service this debt, limiting its ability to implement stimulus measures and potentially pushing the country towards a fiscal crisis. The combination of falling commodity prices, rising unemployment, potential currency collapse, inflationary pressures, and high government debt means a U.S. recession could have truly catastrophic effects on Brazil's economy, far exceeding a simple reduction in U.S. demand. Could Brazil pull through such a confluence of negative factors? Its resilience would be severely tested, and the outcome remains highly uncertain. Let's turn our focus to another Asian powerhouse, India. What if India's celebrated and massive outsourcing industry, a symbol of its modern economic prowess, came crashing down, not because of internal issues, but due to a recession in the United States? It's a startling possibility that highlights a critical, often overlooked, vulnerability. You would be genuinely shocked by the extent to which India's economic stability, particularly in its burgeoning service sector, depends on the health of the U.S. economy. The truth is, India's booming tech and service industries, employing millions and contributing significantly to its GDP, rely heavily on American companies outsourcing their operations. From software development and customer support to data processing and R&D, U.S. corporations are the primary clients for a vast swath of India's service sector. In fact, data indicates that nearly 60% of India's entire IT sector revenue originates from contracts with companies based in the United States. This makes the industry, and by extension, a significant part of the Indian economy, incredibly vulnerable to shifts in American corporate spending. So, what cascade of events would unfold if the U.S. were to enter a recession? A sudden economic slowdown in the United States would inevitably lead American companies, facing declining revenues and market uncertainty, to slash their operational budgets. IT spending and outsourcing contracts are often among the first areas targeted for cost-cutting measures. This would directly and severely hit India's job market, particularly in major technology hubs like Bengaluru and Hyderabad. These cities are thriving ecosystems built around the outsourcing model, and millions of skilled professionals rely on this sector for their livelihoods. A sharp reduction in U.S. contracts would lead to project cancellations, hiring freezes, and widespread layoffs, sending shockwaves through these urban centers and impacting countless families. And guess what? That would directly impact India's job market overall, hitting especially hard in cities like Bengaluru and Hyderabad, where millions rely on tech outsourcing. With significantly less money flowing into the country from these service exports, the consequences would ripple outwards. Companies forced to cut back would reduce salaries or lay off staff, leading to decreased consumer spending domestically. This drop in consumption would hurt local businesses, potentially leading to further job losses in other sectors. The result? A potential massive economic crisis for millions of Indians who depend, directly or indirectly, on the health of the service export sector. But the vulnerability doesn't end with the IT industry. India's economy is also heavily dependent on remittances sent home by the vast Indian diaspora working abroad, a significant portion of whom reside and work in the United States. If the U.S. economy crashes, job opportunities for these workers dwindle, and their ability to send money back home diminishes. This flow of remittances acts as a crucial support system for countless families across India, helping to alleviate poverty and boost local economies. A sharp decline in these funds would leave families struggling and could push millions more people into poverty, exacerbating existing economic disparities. Could India handle such a multi-pronged shock? Not likely, especially considering its already existing challenges with unemployment and maintaining a fragile economic balance. Consider Turkey, a nation strategically positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Have you ever wondered how a U.S. recession could potentially devastate this major regional economy? The interconnectedness might surprise you. You would be truly shocked to learn how intertwined Turkey's economic fate is with the American economy, despite its geographical distance and diverse partnerships. Turkey's economy is already navigating treacherous waters, grappling with persistently high inflation rates that erode purchasing power and a currency, the lira, that has faced significant weakening in recent years. This pre-existing fragility makes it particularly susceptible to external shocks. In fact, analysts often point to Turkey as one of the emerging markets most vulnerable to an economic collapse, should the United States hit a significant recession. Its reliance on external factors creates a precarious situation. How could this scenario unfold? Firstly, Turkey's export market, while diversified, still relies significantly on demand from developed economies, including the U.S., for goods ranging from textiles and apparel to automotive parts and machinery. A downturn in the U.S. economy would inevitably reduce demand for these Turkish goods, impacting manufacturers and exporters. Sending the country's export-driven industries into a tailspin is a significant risk, but that's potentially just the start of the problem. Turkey also depends heavily on foreign investment to finance its current account deficit and fuel economic activity. A large portion of this investment originates from or flows through U.S. financial institutions and investors. During a global economic downturn, particularly one triggered by a U.S. recession, investors typically become risk-averse, pulling capital out of emerging markets perceived as less stable. American investors would likely withdraw their money from Turkey, seeking safer havens. This capital flight would put immense downward pressure on the already weakened Turkish lira. This potential sharp devaluation of the lira is a major threat. It would make imports significantly more expensive, further fueling the already high inflation and squeezing household budgets. It would also increase the burden of foreign currency-denominated debt held by Turkish companies and the government, potentially leading to defaults. Furthermore, Turkey relies on tourism as a significant source of foreign revenue, and American tourists contribute to this sector. A U.S. recession would likely lead to a decrease in American travel abroad, further reducing Turkey's foreign currency inflows. You might think Turkey's strategic location could help it weather the storm, but the reality is its reliance on American trade, capital, and even tourism means a U.S. recession could trigger a severe economic crisis. Imagine inflation skyrocketing further, unemployment rising as export industries suffer, and public discontent reaching a boiling point due to economic hardship. This could lead to significant political instability, compounding the economic crisis. Can Turkey survive without the U.S. economic engine running strong? The answer isn't so clear, and the risks are substantial. Now, let's examine Argentina, a country sadly familiar with economic volatility. Have you ever considered how a nation with such a protracted history of economic struggles, cycles of high inflation, and sovereign debt crises could fare in the face of a global downturn triggered by a U.S. recession? Could it get even worse? Argentina stands as a prime, albeit unfortunate example, of what can happen when pre-existing vulnerabilities collide with external shocks emanating from an economic giant like the U.S. hitting a recession. You would be shocked, though perhaps not entirely surprised given its history, by how much Argentina's fragile stability depends on external economic factors, particularly those linked to the U.S. market and global commodity prices influenced by it. Argentina's economy has been in turmoil for years, with inflation rates recently soaring well over 100% annually, and the peso consistently losing value against major currencies. Despite these immense challenges, the country still relies heavily on its agricultural exports, primarily soybeans, as well as significant amounts of oil and wheat, to generate crucial foreign currency reserves. Many of these exports, or the global prices they fetch, are directly or indirectly influenced by demand in the U.S. market, or the overall health of the global economy, which the U.S. heavily impacts. If the United States faces a recession, global demand for commodities like those Argentina exports would likely plummet. Falling prices for soybeans, oil, and wheat would drastically reduce Argentina's export earnings, which are desperately needed to service its massive foreign debt and stabilize its currency. This reduction in income would hit the agricultural sector hard, impacting farmers and related industries, and reducing employment opportunities in a country already struggling with job creation. Moreover, Argentina's ability to access international credit markets is already severely constrained due to its history of defaults and ongoing negotiations with creditors like the International Monetary Fund. A global recession, coupled with tighter credit conditions often initiated by U.S. banks tightening their belts, could make it virtually impossible for Argentina to secure the loans it needs to roll over its existing debt or finance government spending. This could precipitate another sovereign debt crisis, potentially leading the government to default on its obligations. Imagine the catastrophic consequences. Hyperinflation could spiral completely out of control, wiping out savings. Social unrest could intensify as poverty deepens, and the country could face political chaos. You might think a country accustomed to crisis could somehow manage, but the truth is, its reliance on external trade influenced by the U.S., its desperate need for foreign loans often facilitated by U.S.-centric institutions, and its mountain of existing debt make it extremely vulnerable. Argentina's situation is already a ticking time bomb, and a significant U.S. recession could be the spark that ignites a chain reaction, sending it into an even deeper financial and social abyss. Let's shift our focus to the oil-rich kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine a world where this Middle Eastern powerhouse, seemingly insulated by its immense petroleum wealth, crumbles because of a recession in the United States? It seems implausible at first glance. However, you would be truly shocked to discover just how deeply Saudi Arabia's economic fortunes remain tied to the global energy market, which is heavily influenced by demand from the U.S. While Saudi Arabia has embarked on ambitious plans like Vision 2030 to diversify its economy away from oil, the reality is that petroleum exports still constitute the vast majority of its revenue, often exceeding 90%. And historically, the United States has been one of the kingdom's largest and most crucial customers for that oil. Although the U.S. has increased its domestic production, it remains a major player in setting global oil price benchmarks and influencing overall global demand. Now, picture this scenario. What happens when the U.S. economy faces a significant downturn? Reduced industrial activity, less travel, and lower consumer spending in America invariably lead to a decrease in overall U.S. oil consumption. This reduced demand from such a large consumer contributes significantly to downward pressure on global oil prices. If the U.S. cuts back substantially on oil imports due to a weakened economy or strategic shifts, Saudi Arabia would lose a significant chunk of its primary revenue stream. Falling oil prices driven by lower U.S. and global demand directly impact the kingdom's finances. And guess what? This isn't just a minor budget adjustment. It strikes at the very heart of the Saudi economic model. With oil prices plummeting, Saudi Arabia's entire financial system could come under immense pressure. The government relies heavily on oil revenue to fund everything from massive infrastructure projects and public sector salaries to generous social subsidies and its ambitious diversification initiatives. A sustained drop in oil income could force drastic budget cuts, potentially leading to project delays or cancellations, reductions in public spending, and increased borrowing. You might think Saudi Arabia could simply rely on its substantial foreign reserves to weather the storm. While these reserves provide a cushion, the truth is that oil isn't just their main export. It's the fundamental backbone of their entire economy. A prolonged period of low oil prices could deplete these reserves faster than anticipated, forcing difficult choices. Imagine a kingdom that has spent billions trying to diversify being forced to halt those very projects because the oil money funding them has dried up. What happens when unemployment potentially rises, especially among youth expecting government jobs, and social unrest begins to simmer as subsidies are cut? Saudi Arabia could find itself facing a crisis of unimaginable proportions, challenging its long-term stability and regional influence. Have you ever wondered how a country like Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, blessed with vast resources but plagued by instability, could be impacted by a global recession triggered in the U.S.? Nigeria represents a complex case, a nation whose potential is constantly undermined by internal challenges, making it exceptionally vulnerable to external shocks. You would be shocked by how much Nigeria relies on the volatile global oil market, and consequently, factors influencing U.S. demand to maintain its fragile economy. Nigeria's economy is overwhelmingly dependent on oil exports. Petroleum makes up more than 90% of Nigeria's export revenue, and a substantial portion of government income. While Nigeria exports oil globally, the overall price of crude is heavily influenced by global demand, in which the U.S. plays a critical role. Therefore, when the U.S. faces a recession and demand for oil drops globally, Nigeria's economy takes an immediate and severe hit. The consequences of falling oil prices are devastating for Nigeria. Without the steady cash flow from oil exports, the Nigerian government, already struggling with corruption and inefficiency, could find it incredibly difficult to fund essential public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure maintenance. This could trigger an economic crisis far deeper than just reduced government spending. But the issues don't stop there. Nigeria also faces extreme poverty, high unemployment, especially among its vast youth population, and significant political instability, including security challenges in various regions. A recession in the U.S., leading to lower oil revenues, would exacerbate these pre-existing problems. Fewer government resources mean less capacity to address poverty and unemployment. Economic hardship often fuels social tensions and can worsen security situations. Furthermore, many Nigerian workers abroad, including in the U.S., send vital remittances back home. If the U.S. economy weakens, these financial lifelines could dry up, plunging families further into poverty. Imagine the ripple effect across this nation of over 200 million people. Fewer jobs as government spending contracts, higher inflation if the currency weakens due to lack of foreign exchange, and a growing sense of unrest and desperation. You might think Nigeria's sheer size and resource wealth could offer some protection, but in reality, its over-reliance on oil ties the nation's fate directly to the global oil market, heavily influenced by giants like the U.S. Compounded by its fragile infrastructure, political instability, and deep-seated poverty, the country struggles to absorb such shocks. Could a U.S. recession push Nigeria over the brink? Could this be the breaking point for Africa's most populous nation? The country may struggle desperately to recover, facing a potential full-blown economic and social disaster. The answer might surprise you with its starkness. Finally, let's consider China, the world's second-largest economy. Have you ever stopped to think about how this economic behemoth, often seen as a rival or alternative to the U.S., might be profoundly affected by a U.S. recession? It's a relationship defined by both competition and deep interdependence. China, which has experienced decades of almost unprecedented rapid growth, fueled significantly by its manufacturing prowess and export machine, could find itself in serious trouble if its largest customer, the United States, falters. The reality, often obscured by geopolitical narratives, is shocking in its implications. China remains heavily dependent on the U.S. market for its exports and has significant financial ties through investments and debt holdings. China exports an astonishing volume of goods to the United States every single year, historically nearing, and sometimes exceeding, $450 billion worth. These exports range from electronics and machinery to textiles and furniture, forming the backbone of China's manufacturing sector, which employs hundreds of millions of people. But what happens when that crucial trade lifeline is constricted? In the event of a U.S. recession, American consumer demand for Chinese goods would inevitably take a nosedive. U.S. businesses would also cut back on imports. This would deal a severe blow to China's manufacturing sector, the engine that has driven its economic miracle. Factories would face reduced orders, leading to slowdowns, closures, and significant job losses. This could trigger widespread consequences: rising unemployment, particularly in coastal manufacturing hubs, potentially leading to social unrest, decreased corporate profits, and an overall slowdown in China's economic growth, which the government relies on for legitimacy and stability. But the vulnerability isn't limited to just the loss of the U.S. export market. That's just the beginning. China is also grappling with a massive internal debt crisis, particularly in its real estate sector, with corporate debt levels reaching potentially unsustainable heights. The Chinese government and businesses have borrowed extensively, both domestically and internationally, to fuel growth. A significant economic slowdown triggered by a U.S. recession would make it much harder for companies and local governments to service this enormous debt, potentially leading to defaults and a financial crisis. Furthermore, if U.S. companies, facing their own economic uncertainties, pull back on investments in China, it would further dampen economic activity. Imagine the scenario: a country that has thrived on rapid expansion suddenly hit with an economic crisis, struggling to manage mounting debts while dealing with a shrinking export market and slowing domestic growth. How long could China maintain its economic trajectory under such intense pressure? To compound matters, a U.S. recession would also mean reduced global demand overall for China's exports, as other countries tighten their belts. This would hit Chinese manufacturers even harder, further straining an already fragile economic situation defined by high debt and slowing growth. It's not just a concern for China. A major slowdown in the world's second-largest economy would have profound ripple effects across the entire global landscape. Wow! The intricate tapestry of the global economy reveals a startling degree of interdependence, particularly concerning the influence of the United States. It's clear that the economic instability potentially caused by a significant U.S. recession wouldn't be contained within American borders. It threatens to unleash devastating consequences upon some of the world's largest and most dynamic economies, as well as those already struggling with fragility. The potential for a domino effect is undeniable. From oil-dependent nations like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, whose entire budgets hinge on energy prices often dictated by U.S. demand, to global manufacturing hubs like China and South Korea, heavily reliant on American consumers, the ripple effects are profound and far-reaching. Countries like Mexico and Canada, bound by geography and deep trade integration, face immediate and severe impacts. Nations like India and Turkey, dependent on service exports, remittances, and foreign investment linked to the U.S., are also exceptionally vulnerable. And for countries like Brazil and Argentina, already battling internal economic demons, A U.S. downturn could push them over the edge into deeper crisis. The question remains, will these nations possess the resilience to withstand such a shock, or could we witness a cascade of economic collapses under the immense pressure? The future economic health of many nations appears precariously balanced, highlighting the critical need for diversification and robust global economic cooperation. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with others. We are committed to bringing you more content like this, and your support helps us continue to provide eye-opening insights into global economics. Stay tuned for more, and remember to hit that bell for notifications on future videos. Thanks for watching.